You guys, ever since I was little, I've loved movies about shrinking people and miniature people and people holding smaller people in their hand and people going inside people. And throughout cinematic history, there have been absolute classics like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids to present-day blockbusters like Antman. But it doesn't stop there. Horton Hears a Who, MIB, Downsizing, and so much more we'll get into today. In this video, let's take a closer look at the visual and practical effects of how each movie showed shrinking and miniaturization. So unlock that cupboard, swallow that school bus, and let's get small. First, let's go down the rabbit hole and visit 1951's Alice in Wonderland, who was able to shrink with an unusual potion.
Tastes like cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, goodness!
To create trippy visuals like these, Disney would first film something called live-action reference, using actors to play out the scene, then handing it all off to the animators to create pencil tests, which were then photographed frame by frame. It took forever, and everyone probably got carpal tunnel syndrome, but the end result gave us the OG shrinking moment. Fast forward to the live-action version, and Tim Burton put his own spin on it. This shot was deceptively simple to accomplish. All they had to do on set was raise the camera higher to give us the illusion that she was shrinking away from us. And after creating a CG dress falling over her at its original size, they put her head back on and boom, $1 billion at the box office and just so much Hot Topic merch. But before we had fancy things like 3D software, movies had to get a little creative. While on vacation with his wife, Scott passes through a strange mist that ends up rearranging his molecular structure. It starts off subtle, with his clothes no longer fitting him and his wedding ring slipping off, but soon he becomes too small to ignore. For shots like this, they used forced perspective, having the actors sit at a different distance from camera than the others, a method that was used heavily on Lord of the Rings to make Gandalf interact with Frodo. An even trickier scene was when Scott fights off a spider. Oh. To go that small, they had to create some oversized sets and props, like a 15-foot mousetrap or a 40-pound pair of scissors. At the end of the movie, Scott realizes that his shrinking will never stop. What awaits him as he becomes so small? The microscopic becomes the infinite. Before Antman did the quantum realm, Shrinking Man seeded the idea. But now, let's move over to a subgenre of shrinking, going inside the human body. Fantastic Voyage from 1966 introduced a submarine crew that shrinks down and is injected into a dying scientist in order to save him from a blood clot. Back then, technology hadn't quite caught up to the film's ambitions, and you can see they had trouble merging the actors with the background.
Background is kind of what we call scissoring.
I'm sorry, what? And when they weren't using large glass tanks to create the bloodstream footage, they actually built out enormous sets for the actors to float through. But since they didn't have the technology to remove the wires they were attached to, they just painted them the same color as the background, wobbled the camera and blurred the hell out of everything so you wouldn't see them. Clever ways to deal with a problem they just didn't have the tools for yet. But almost 20 years later in 1987, a little movie called Innerspace would take that same idea to a whole other level. After a tiny Dennis Quaid gets injected into Martin Short's ass, it starts a miniature adventure of epic proportions. To make the human body of Innerspace as believable as possible, they built out this huge track with water running through it and placed in a model of the ship to look like it was traveling through the inside of a vein. But the creativity didn't stop there. When the bad guys are shrunk to 50% of their size, they start attacking our heroes in a wild car chase.
Stop this car! Insignificant little pipsqueak, I'm in charge here.
To get all this to work, they cut a car in half and built the back seat at 4 times the size. This looked alright for the most part, but what about when big and small characters had to interact with each other? They built enormous puppets for the bad guys to grab onto, and tiny ones for the good guys to throw around. For the time, this clever camera trickery won the film an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, and in a way, predicted the rise of nanotechnology.
Everything, instead of getting more complicated and bigger, everything got smaller. Computers used to take up huge rooms, and now they take up this.
He's got a point. Just think about what phones used to look like. These days, they're way smaller. And now on to everyone's childhood favorite, the Magic School Bus.
Seatbelts, everyone! No one else was already wearing a seatbelt?
In the second episode of the first season, the class shrinks down to the size of a cheesy Weasel and gets eaten by fellow classmate Arnold.
Arnold?
And although the class would shrink in later episodes, there was just something about this one that stuck with me, even though there was this shot, where Arnold is inside Arnold? But whatever, I'll let that slide. They pass through his mouth, then his esophagus. How did he survive this? Before entering his stomach? Huh, this episode is more nasty than I remember. But as a kid, I learned way more from Miss Frizzle than I ever did from my own teachers. Voiced by Lily Tomlin, who was no stranger to being small, the eccentric instructor never missed an opportunity to teach and inspire, even as she was about to literally die. So how did they create such wild and vivid ideas, like microscopic students swimming around in digestive juice? It took a huge team of people, from writers to scientists, working out the script and storyboards, a colorful cast of kids lending their voices.
What's happening?
What's going on? Whoa! Oh, bad, bad, bad!
And talented artists to illustrate the iconic characters. Fun fact, to paint the more than 20,000 frames for a single episode, they would send off a portion of the work to Seoul, Korea, where an army of artists would finish every background and photograph it all, look familiar, to create a workable episode. And even while that was going on, Foley artists had to use different household objects to create all kinds of wacky sound effects. No, let them cook. In 1989, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids would change the shrinking genre forever. When the Zelinsky kids and their neighbors are accidentally shrunken down to the size of insects, their unsuspecting dad starts sweeping up the mess. After an enormous studio was used to build out just one tiny section of the floorboard, a giant broom made out of foam required a team of people to move it. When it came time to be dumped into a garbage bag, the actors slid down a humongous pink slide along oversized props, with more dangerous shots left to stunt doubles. Their dad takes the trash out just a few feet, but to the kids, it might as well have been miles. They cut open the bag to reveal the eerie and alien world of their own backyard, where they can slide down blades of grass, spend the night in giant Lego bricks, and find a hearty meal by eating a massive leftover cookie. Can you imagine how much sugar they're taking in? Later on, the kids get picked up by a bee and go for the ride of their lives. To get this sequence, they first carried a camera through the backyard. Then they made a giant furry bee for the actors to grab onto. And for wider shots, they made a smaller bee, along with miniature puppets of all the kids. To see all the hard work the team put in to build practical sets and props really cemented Honey, I Shrunk the Kids as the definitive shrinking movie. Almost 10 years later, it was the parents' turn to shrink in Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves.
It's a big family movie with really short parents.
Got 'em. And like any third film in a trilogy, it went straight to home video and no one saw it. Just kidding. While they used way more CGI than the first movie and relied on blue screen way too much.
It's been strange working with blue screen.
Everything is blue. We make it up as we go along.
It made up for it with some wildly inventive sequences that still stay in my mind to this day. Like sliding down this pole. You're gonna love this! Falling into some dip. And who could forget the Hot Wheels scene? After building out a huge track, the parents all get into a life-size toy car and take it for a drive. By the way, I love how they didn't even bother putting them into the wide shots. And now let's check in with 1997's Men in Black. More specifically, a morgue in New York, where we're about to see some wild shit.
The guy's head opens up, and there's like a little green guy driving the body.
Originally meant as just a throwaway gag, the director loved it so much, he made it a crucial plot point. And to get it to work, they turned to the absolute legend, 7-time Oscar-winning creature designer, Rick Baker. The team created a cockpit within a human head, with working LCD screens and LED lights. But when it came to what sat in the chair, this little guy caused some big problems, since he was already super small. To get his even smaller mouth to move, all the wiring had to pass through his neck, which was no bigger than a pencil. It worked for the most part, but to push it even further, they built a big version. Bet you didn't see that coming. Having it at a much bigger scale let them cram in even more robotics, making the eyes blink, the lips move around, and the chest breathe in and out. And a bigger alien needed an even bigger head to sit in. More than 20 years later at MIB International, another little alien was created, but even though the CG model had more realistic textures and facial animation, there was just something special about doing it old school, like you could reach out and hold it in your hand. In the very same year, we were introduced to a new breed of tiny people, the Borrowers. Standing at just 5 inches tall, they scrounge for leftover bits of food and materials that no one would ever notice. The production designer, who would go on to win Emmys for her work on Game of Thrones, created all sorts of oversized props, from plugs, paper clips, and radios, to boots as tall as buildings.
The attention to detail is the thing that really, to me, makes a great movie.
The cement coming through, I mean, the details that Gemma Jackson brought in, it's just gorgeous.
It's that kind of detail that brought scenes like this to life. Anyway, when it came time for the visual effects, the supervisor had to take careful measurements to make sure big and small would fit together. For a scene like this, where human and borrower meet for the first time, they shot each performance separately, with the other actors standing off camera, reading back the lines. Later on, when Ariete gets trapped inside a freezer, her dad comes to the rescue. To make something so epic feel like one continuous shot, they had to split it into parts. The first was a blue screen of the actor. The kitchen counter would then be dropped in behind him. Next, they used a stuntman in a mocap suit, whose data would then be translated to a digital double, capable of doing things the actor just couldn't. As the refrigerator covers up the CG version, the real actor would then pop back into frame. And from beneath the floorboards to a floating speck of dust, 2008 gave us Horton Hears a Who. This movie took a classic Dr. Seuss story and updated it for the digital age. With modern technology, they could animate Horton the elephant doing all sorts of crazy things, like twerking. Whew, Horton about to make me act up. But when he comes across a speck of dust that seems to be calling for help, he suspects that there's something or someone living inside.
There can't really be people as small as a mite. Well, there can, and there are, because Horton was right.
To create this living, breathing, microscopic world, they first made animatics, moving storyboards that showed all the action and camera movements. From all this, they knew exactly how to bring Whoville to life. For 2008, this movie got pretty creative, both visually and philosophically.
What if there was someone way out there, looking down on our world right now? And to them, we're the specks.
The MIB movies asked a pretty similar question. What if everything we know was just in a locker at some alien airport? Or what if our entire universe was in a marble that some alien was playing with? Who's playing with that alien's universe marble? Or that moon looks like a Capri Sun straw hole? What if we were all just inside a Capri Sun? Oh, I gotta sit down. And now we get to the MCU's entry to the shrinking genre, 2015's Antman. Starting from a rich history in the comics, Marvel struck gold when they cast Paul Rudd in the role. After getting his hands on the Ant-Man suit, Scott puts it on, and with a press of a button, his life would change forever. An elevated cutaway of a bathtub was made to get Scott's perspective, and while some of it was filmed on a blue screen stage, they created a fully CG version of Ant-Man and the bathtub environment to get even crazier shots. And with such a charismatic actor, they went out of their way to keep his eyes visible in his helmet. By doing this, you could see all of his reactions to everything that was going on. On top of that, an entirely new unit was formed that focused on macro photography.
We spent weeks and weeks filming the tiniest details within bank vaults, within ATM machines, the tile work of bathrooms, the tiniest of pipes, the first floor and a second floor between buildings.
With all this data, they could create detailed and realistic CG renderings of common household environments. And when the line between what's real and computer generated becomes so blurred, everything from the diorama shootout to running on top of a gun can trick the audience into believing these tiny, pulse-pounding moments. With the introduction of Wasp in the sequel, we got even crazier mini fight scenes. And even though the wonder of shrinking was totally absent in Quantumania, at least we'll always have these moments.
Red shrinks.
Nailed it! Sorry about this. Anthony, little help.
In 2016, we visited the faraway land of Zootopia, where animals of all shapes and sizes coexist and thrive. In such a whimsical place, where so much research was used to create such visually rich environments, sectioned off by climate and split up into districts, Judy Hopps chases a weasel and finds herself in a tiny city called Little Rodentia. So how do you make such a tiny world feel real and lived in? Before they did any work, they put a real hamster in a tiny city for some inspiration. Then starting from concept sketches in previs, and working out everything else from the clothing on their backs, this mad dash through a city of mice showed their commitment to size difference.
A lot of these kind of talking animal films take the big characters like elephants, and kind of shrink them down, and small characters like mice and kind of scale them up.
But by embracing the contrast in scale between all species of animals, Disney made Little Rodentia a refreshing example of a minuscule world.
Sorry, coming through. Excuse me.
I love what this mouse is doing. And finally, we get to 2017's Downsizing. This movie got to show off some pretty interesting ideas. Sure, there were oversized props used to set up dialogue scenes, green screen replaced with CG backgrounds to create gigantic surroundings, but where this movie shines is making the most mundane moments feel totally believable. When the world sees the first successful trial of miniaturization, a cart full of tiny people is wheeled out on stage at a press conference. Rather than use rough models for reference, they use today's technology to create hyper-realistic 3D prints of all the actors. Having these on the cart made it much easier for the audience to react. But to film the real actors, they had to solve a big problem.
We knew that we were never going to be able to use a motion base big enough to move that cart full of 38 people, so we decided to solve that by moving the camera towards a stationary set, which when you're done photographing it makes it look like the cart is moving toward the camera.
And for this part, they shot a box with 3D figures inside, which was helpful for lighting reference and also figuring out where the camera should focus. Then, on a giant green screen stage, they filmed the actual actors in a huge box, tilting on a hydraulic mechanism. And with both elements shot, they lined them together and then cleaned it all up. And for this part, using a handful of 3D printed people again, the real actors were once more filmed on a giant moving compartment that would then be lined up with the movement of the bus. Later on, we finally get a look at the downsizing procedure. Unfortunately, when he wakes up, Matt Damon finds out that his wife got cold feet and didn't shrink down with him.
You're upset? You're upset? I'm the one who's 5 inches tall!
And if you've made it this far into the video, enjoy this chill-ass montage of other examples of shrinking in miniatures. So at the end of this tiny little video, I hope you've gotten a closer look at how movies have made people shrink or become miniature through the years, using countless creative methods like live action reference, forced perspective, oversized sets and props, blue screens, digital doubles, animatics, macro photography, and so much more. The cinematic history of making people small has been a fun and inventive journey. Did I miss anyone? Let me know. I think I got them all. Anyway, thank you for listening to me ramble. Hey, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.